Hey everyone, it's Ben from Board to Bits, and welcome to part 15 of our series on making a custom character controller in Unity. So now that our player's hitbox is functioning, we can actually start interacting with objects in our game world. First thing we want to do is we want to double check that we know that our hitbox is activating, but we want to make sure it's actually detecting collisions with objects. We can do that pretty easily. We're going to jump into our player hitbox script, and all we need to do down here at the bottom of our script, we're going to add a quick method called void OnTriggerEnter. We don't need to pass this any parameters. We can, and we might do so in a minute, but we can start off right now with no parameters in here. And what this is going to do is this is going to detect whenever a collider enters our trigger space. What's nice is that if we enable our trigger and there's a collider already within it, this event will still be called. So we can say OnTriggerEnter, and we'll simply debug log something like collider present. So if we jump back over to Unity and we hit our play button, we can now press Z to activate our hitbox. And we do see that there is in fact a collider present. One appears. And which is a little bit odd because there's nothing really in front of us right now, but sure enough something is colliding. If I go in front of, say, this box here, we've got this obstacle in our way. Now I hit it. Now two colliders are present. That's a little bit weird. That's not necessarily what we want because we obviously don't have anything in our game world yet that we want to interact with. So why is that happening? Well, we can check easily enough. Instead of saying just collider present, we can actually check what the collider is it's detecting right now. We can do that by putting in one parameter here called collider. I'll just call it COL. So it's a type of collider, COL. And instead of just logging that there's some kind of collider present, we can say debug log col.name, and that'll tell us exactly what is being triggered, what is triggering this. So let's hit play again and see now. So now we're just standing on the ground, empty space in front of us. We hit Z. Sure enough, we're hitting the ground. And that's because we have our cube is set at this size that it is technically just, grazing the ground level. Likewise, if we go over to this obstacle here, now we hit Z, we're hitting both the obstacle and the ground. We're hitting two things now. We don't really want this. We don't want to just be hitting random environmental objects. We only want to hit things that we can actually interact with. So there's a couple of ways we could do this, but Unity has a built-in solution to this that we're going to take advantage of today, which is our physics layers. If we look at something like our player hitbox, we see that it has this layer up here. And if we click this drop-down menu, we see that there's a few options. There's transparent effects, ignoring raycast, water, and UI. And then we have this option to add layers. Layers are used for a few different things. They can be used for camera purposes, but they can also be used for physics in terms of determining what objects can detect what other objects. And that's what we're going to use right now. So I'm going to jump here and I'm going to click this add layer. And it brings us into this new inspector here where we can add some user layers up to 8 through 31 here can be user layers that we can add for our game. You can also get access to this if you go to Edit, Project Settings, Tags and Layers. It will bring you to the same thing. Bear in mind, though, you might have tags or sorting layers opened instead. So in here, I'm going to add two user layers. The first one I'm going to call Player Hitbox. And the second one I'm going to call Interact Target. And you can, I believe, put spaces in here. I'm going to keep them out for now. You can do it either way you like. Just bear in mind which way you wrote these here. So now I'm going to jump back over to our player hitbox, and I'm going to change its layer from default to the player hitbox. And lastly, what I need to do is we need to now tell Unity the player hitbox should only interact with, or it should only detect interact targets. So we're going to go back to Edit, Project Settings, and now we're going to go down to where it says Physics here. And here you'll see a bunch of information about gravity, other stuff, but what's really important here is this layer collision matrix. And what this is basically a chart, and it shows every possible combination. Only one of each, though, so there's default goes to UI here, but you'll notice that UI doesn't go to default because it's not directionally significant. This determines both interactions, whether UI will interact with default or default will interact with UI. And so what we really care about here is our player hitbox. We do want our player hitbox to interact with the interact target, but we don't want it to interact with anything else. We don't want our player hitbox to interact with default. We don't want it to interact with transparent effects, ignore raycast, water, UI, or even itself. On the off chance that we, have something funky going on with the multiple hitboxes flying around, we don't want them to interact with each other. So only now our player hitbox will only interact with the interact target. So if we hit play now, we walk around our scene, I can hit the Z button and you can notice that nothing is actually colliding. I can even click on so we can see the collider light up, but it is not actually colliding with, or it's not detecting a collision or a trigger with any of our environmental objects. So that works for preventing unwanted triggers, but now we actually do want to trigger an interaction with some kind of object. So let's create that now. We're going to create a game object, 3D object, create a sphere. We're going to reset the transform so we can actually see that here. I'm going to move it over in front of this cube here. And I'll just kind of put it roughly on the ground. It's not really going to interact with the ground, so we don't have to worry about that. I'm also going to create a couple of things in our project folder here. In our materials, I'm going to create a new material, and I'm going to call this interaction material. And we're just going to use this to kind of track our interactions. I'm going to set its color to start. We'll set its color to like a kind of like a dull orange. And I'm going to turn its smoothness all the way down, but that's just a aesthetic choice I make. And I'm going to drag that onto there. So that's how it starts. It's just kind of in this, I'll even darken that up a little bit more. It's just kind of in this off position. And what we're going to basically tell this object to do ultimately is when we interact with it, we'll make it bright so it looks like it's turning on. And that'll be our most basic interaction that we can start with. In order to do that, though, we need to do some scripting in order to tell this object that it should be changing when it gets interacted with. So we'll jump into our model scripts folder, and we'll add a new C# script, and I'm going to call this interact object. I'm going to add this immediately to our sphere, and I should really rename this something, so I'm going to rename this here interact sphere. So we've got an interact sphere, has an interact object on it, and an interact material. So, we've got kind of a theme going here. Now let's open up interact object in MonoDevelop. Now you'll notice I didn't change this sphere's layer up here, and I did that on purpose. The reason I'm doing that is because I don't want, even if we change that layer and it can suddenly detect this sphere, it doesn't know for sure that there is, this interact object script it's going to be able to call upon it. So what I want to do instead is I want to make this script in charge of changing that layer so that when we do find something that we can detect that trigger, we know that it has that script on it. So how we're going to do that is we're going to go into our start function here. We're actually going to delete our update function. We don't need that for this particular script. And so here in our start function, we're going to set the layer through the script. So we're going to say GameObject.layer. You'll notice this is an integer. So we need to get the integer of this layer. There's a couple of ways we can do this, but I'm going to do this the most simply, which is I'm going to jump back here, go to our Edit, Project Settings, Tags, and Layers. We see that our interact target layer is layer number 9. So we can simply say layer equals 9. Now, in addition to this, we also want to be able to access that material so that we can change it when we do interact with it. So we're going to create a material variable up here. I'm just going to call this mat. And then in our start function, we'll say mat equals getComponent mesh renderer dot, oh, not that, dot material. And that will get actually the first material, but for our purposes, that's the only one that's on here. With all that said, we can now create a function that can be called on when our hitbox detects this object. We're going to tell it to interact and change its material. So we can simply create a public void interact function. And inside here, all we're going to say is mat.color. Can we do set? We can set it there, or we can set it through set color. We can just do it through color. Mat.color equals color.green. So when the sphere turns bright green, we know we've successfully interacted with it. Lastly, we now need some way to say down here, instead of when we detect it, instead of just writing its name in the console, we're actually going to tell it to activate that interact method, call that interact method, and change the material color. So we'll simply do that by saying call.getComponent interact object dot interact. Now, like I say, the reason that we're able to call this here is because we know that if it's detecting this collider, we know that it has the proper layer, and the only way it's getting that layer is by having this interact object script, or this interact object component attached to it. It's a little bit arbitrary, and it's a little bit of a gotcha. We might want to, in the future, create kind of a bug check to say, just in case this is null, if somehow something got that layer without this component on it, we would probably want to check that. But for right now, our purposes, this is a pretty simple scene. We can just say, we know that because it's able to collide with it, we know it has this component, therefore we can interact with it. So we'll save this. We can jump back over to Unity, save our scene. Let's hit play and see how this works now. So we can walk around. We hit Z here. We're not interacting with the obstacle or the ground. That's just what we want. But if we come over here, now we're, in fact, I'll even click this here so we see that the sphere is now overlapping this our hitbox, and we hit Z now, interacts with the sphere properly, changes the color of it because it is an interactable object. So that's really the basics of how we can now interact with our world. Instead of changing the color, you can obviously put whatever kind of information you want in there. And really, interacting and attacking are roughly the same idea, except that we're going to also be passing in some sort of damage information. And that's what we're going to jump into in our next video. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.